Good evening, everybody. James Hancock here. Hope everyone had a great weekend. Back to review episode 4 of Sharp Objects, an episode called Ripe. I thought tonight's episode was absolutely sensational, and now that we're officially at the halfway mark of this miniseries, I think I'm ready to declare Sharp Objects one of my favorite shows of the year. I think the acting is extraordinary. I love how the show is willing to explore really dark subject matter, and as we saw tonight, it has some of the best editing that I've seen in a TV show ever. As I get into my recap, I'll call attention to specific scenes, but the editing style in this show is light years beyond what you typically see on television. But before I get to my recap, I did want to call attention to an article by Nellie Andreeva in Deadline. Apparently, Casey Bloys, HBO's president of programming, confirmed that there will be no season 2 of Sharp Objects, and that is not because the show has not been a success, but in that there's only one novel that the show is based on. They feel like a miniseries is most appropriate, and they also acknowledge that Amy Adams is looking for a little bit of a break from such dark material moving forward. But just to give you an idea of how many people are watching this show, apparently the premiere had 1.5 million views, but if you take in all the additional views from all the different platforms in the days and weeks to come after, it actually was a little bit over 2 million. And while that's dropped a tad in subsequent episodes, obviously at this point Sharp Objects has been a nice success for HBO overall. But enough procrastinating on my part. I think I'm ready to dive into this episode because there's a lot of dark, juicy stuff for us to sink our teeth into. Much to my relief, the episode begins with Camille Preaker having stayed up all night looking for the iPod that she chucked out the window, and thankfully as the sun starts to rise, she finds it and puts it back to good use. Because by some strange coincidence, this show is playing a ton of songs that were absolutely essential to my childhood. One of my favorite songs that they continue to use episode after episode is Led Zeppelin's song Thank You from Led Zeppelin 2. Definitely downloaded on iTunes. The song rocks. And we also had a nice scene later in the episode where Adora's husband was rocking out to Riders on the Storm by the Doors. He was actually playing the piano part along with the keyboard. When I was 14, the Oliver Stone film The Doors came out, which basically ignited a whole new generation of Doors fanatics. Now absolutely fell under their sway for a little while. But early in the episode, we get one of the great examples of the editing I was calling attention to earlier. We see Camille back in her home, and Amma's apologizing to her for some of her behavior the previous evening. But we see through Camille's perspective that anytime she sees a fork, anytime she sees a screw, she basically gets these like lightning bolt flashes that I interpreted as a temptation to start digging into her flesh again. It was a really vivid reminder that all day, every day, she has to resist that temptation to carve into her flesh. And I have a feeling that's one of the main reasons why she basically is sipping on vodka all day, every day. In this episode in particular, I don't think there's a single scene where she doesn't have one of those water bottles that she hides her vodka in. And obviously her proximity to Adora is only exacerbating the situation. I mean, Adora continues to be such a classic manipulator. There's this great bit early on in the episode when her husband is serving her breakfast and she tells him to cut it into smaller pieces. And he happily complies. It reminded me of this great stand-up bit by Joe Rogan where Joe Rogan was talking about how he lives with his wife and 3 daughters and that he regards his own masculinity or his own manhood as a jar of marbles, and that every day his wife and 3 daughters take a few of those marbles away. In any case, Adora's husband is definitely giving away far too many marbles at this point. But the rest of the episode is concerned with 2 things. The town is getting ready for Calhoun Day. Calhoun Day is basically a local celebration celebrating some of the frontiersmen who settled the area. But we also see that Willis and Camille are still very actively involved in their investigation. Willis and Camille basically agree to a mutual exchange where she'll show him local crime scenes in exchange for going on the record with a few statements. But as Willis is explaining to the chief this bargain that he's made, we get yet another taste of the superb editing and sound mixing of this particular episode. This is a technique that's been around for decades, going back to like Alfred Hitchcock's film, The 39 Steps, where you see one thing, but you cut to another scene with the sound from the subsequent scene. Very famously in 39 Steps, a woman sees a dead body, turns to shriek, and we just hear a train whistle as it cuts to the train. But they did a similar thing in this episode where the chief is taking a bite of fruit, and as he does so, they cut to this forklift making this horrible sound. And those little creative flourishes are just what make this show so special. But in terms of the actual murder mystery, I feel like this episode had a ton of red herrings. Camille goes to a lunch with a bunch of her old friends, and they're all getting hammered, and they're all gossiping, and they're talking about sex and rumors and things like that. And I feel like this show is throwing a lot of information at us in order to muddy the waters and keep us on our toes. A lot of the town at this point is convinced that John is the killer just because he happens to be a little weird and unusual and a little more sensitive than your average boy in this environment. The least sensitive person in this environment seems to be Amma. We get this great scene where Amma and her friends are rehearsing their play for Calhoun Day. And initially it appears as if the director of the play is just uninvested emotionally in his work. But as he goes outside and is smoking a cigarette and Amma comes out to talk to him, it's very clear that Amma and the director have a sexual history. and that most likely she's the one that broke it off and broke his heart. But for me, the most interesting stuff this episode was out in the woods with Camille and Willis basically going on a guided tour of all the suicides and murders and rapes and violent crimes that have taken place in the area. We hear a lot of grim stories about what it's like to be a teenage girl growing up in this environment. In particular, there's one ritual, and as far as Willis is concerned, it's straight up criminal behavior. The football team basically has this ritual or this tradition where they take a single cheerleader out to this environment to have sex, and whether or not it's rape or consensual or a gangbang, it's a little ambiguous, it's a little unclear, but obviously it had enormous impact on Camille as a teenager, and she keeps having flashbacks of it. Every time she sees an insect of any kind, it cuts back to her looking at the ground where she was focusing on these insects in the dirt while these football players were moving in a very predatory fashion. And from a purely technical perspective, this episode was absolutely fascinating because we can't quite tell when Camille is in the present or in the past, because when she sees things like the woodshed out in the woods, she will drift in and out of flashbacks. Sometimes when we see the shed, we see that it's filled with pornography. Sometimes we'll see meat hanging on hooks. And apparently the two murder victims were known for spending a lot of time out of that particular woodshed. When Willis seems to pick up on the fact that something horrible happened to Camille in that same shed, they have what's at first a very awkward erotic encounter. He tries to kiss her and she kind of turns her head away, and then it abruptly turns very hot where she grabs his hand, starts sliding it down her pants. But as she does so, she starts having these rapid fire images flash through her head. She sees blood spilling, she starts imagining injuries. She basically gets overwhelmed with the intensity of the moment and ends up biting down on him. I mean, I didn't know whether or not I should scream in horror or if I was aroused or both. It was a very intense little scene, but I do like seeing how Willis and Camille are developing a bond, because when he takes her home, they actually do get to share a little goodnight kiss. So as much as Adora might be having a negative impact on Camille, it seems like Willis is a very positive influence in her life. But as I mentioned earlier, this episode is filled with all these red herrings, and while Camille is out in the woods, we see that the chief goes to have a sit down with Adora, and he says he needs to talk to her about her daughters, and he says one is dangerous and one is in danger. However, as he said it, I realized he didn't specify which. And on the surface, obviously, from what we hear Adora saying on a regular basis, it'd be easy to infer that he's suggesting that Camille is dangerous and that Amma is in danger. But the fact that he didn't mention either by name makes me suspect that there might be some wiggle room there in terms of our interpretation of the scene. But when Camille finally gets home, this is where we get the line where the name of the episode comes from. The name of the episode was Ripe. And as Adora's chastising Camille for being willful and never sweet, as she's about to leave the room, she smells her and says, "You smell ripe." And I didn't immediately know how to interpret that line. My first instinct was that somehow Adora suspects that Camille has been off in the woods getting frisky with a boy. Whether or not there are additional meanings to that line, I will defer to smarter people than myself to say. But we also get a scene where we realize that Adora is not cruel exclusively to Camille. Her husband at one point confronts her and says, "You weren't the only person who lost a daughter." Obviously, from the way he says it, for years, she has set herself up as the sole person needing to be consoled in this household due to her grief. And when he confronts her about this, she immediately snarls at him. I mean, she switches immediately, but she reminds me of a glass cannon, or almost like a body without skin, where she knows how to dish it out, but she doesn't know how to take it. And immediately she turns on him. She says, "Why are you trying to hurt me?" I mean, it's for somebody who's trying to dodge a question or an accusation, this is classic manipulative behavior. But as we get toward the end of the episode, we get a really essential, crucial scene that I'm still digesting, but I imagine a lot of people are going to be thinking along the same lines that I am. We get yet another great cut where Adora's popping pills, and we cut to Camille drinking at the bar. Obviously, they both have substance problems. They just choose to indulge in different vices. But we see that Camille is talking to John at the bar. She tells John that in spite of what the town thinks, she does not suspect him of having murdered his sister. And John starts to tell Camille some stories about Natalie, about how when they were back in Philly, at one point Natalie got in a fight with another girl and jabbed a pencil in her eye, and that once they moved to this environment, Natalie and the other murder victim used to fight pretty frequently, and that it was Amma who would get in between them and stop them. And then John says something that really sets Camille's imagination ablaze, where he says that Amma and the two murder victims were frequently seen together at that shed out in the woods. And from that point on, the episode goes completely crazy in terms of editing. We get this montage where you can't quite tell, is it flashbacks, is it present, is it dreams, is it reality, or just an interesting mix of all the above. But we get this insane imagery. We see girls roller skating at night with boys following them in a car, shooting over their heads, shooting through stop signs. We see Camille in the shed looking down at a body. The way I interpreted that, my suspicion is that Camille as a young girl found a dead body in that shed, but we're basically seeing Camille as an adult having that flashback. But we'll need more information before I can confirm that. And then we get this really ambiguous shot that brings the episode to a close, where we see Amma roller skating at night and she spins around and faces the camera. And I'm not quite ready to call out Amma on anything specific, but the way I interpreted the scene is that Camille now suspects that Amma had some sort of major involvement in the murder of those two girls. And it was the perfect cliffhanger with which to end the halfway point of this season. And in the preview after the credits, we see there's all sorts of craziness coming our way in episode 5. They actually do have Calhoun Day, and surprise, surprise, people get drunk, people get accusatory, people get hostile. It'll be interesting to see what goes down at this giant celebration. So suffice to say, I'm having an absolute blast watching this show. It just combines so many different flavors that I find really interesting. And as much as I am just enjoying the story in terms of plot, I just feel like when it comes to filmmaking technique, when it comes to acting, when it comes to writing, this show is one of the best things you can find on TV right now. But I hope you enjoyed my reaction and review. Please consider subscribing to my channel. If you want to talk more, you can always find me on Twitter at Colbrax, or leave me a comment in the comments below. But thank you so much for watching, and I'll talk to y'all in the very near future. Onwards and upwards.